Welcome to Power Play. I'm Evan Solomon. On our program today, the final debate. Did it transform the campaign?
Mr. O'Toole, who says he wants to get all of Canada vaccinated to 90% in the coming 2 months, can't even convince his own candidates to get vaccinated to 90%.
We have to get through the pandemic first. Why did you not have that approach to the election, Mr. Trudeau?
Leaders face off for the first and only time in English last night. Who stood out? Who missed the moment? Will the leader performances sway voters? Did a defining issue emerge? Pollster Nick Nanos is standing by. We'll bring in strategists to break it all down, plus the final push. Who can now get out the vote?
We'll have our platform released on Saturday.
This is a time when Canadians should get to be very clear about how they want to end this pandemic.
Nobody asked for this election. We didn't call it. Justin Trudeau forced an election in the middle of a pandemic.
Advance polls are open. Leaders have one more week to pitch their platforms. What can you expect to see in the desperate final days? And have we just heard the strangest admission ever on the trail from a political leader about why she isn't campaigning with her other candidates? We'll tell you about Annamie Paul's campaign confession. The press gallery will break it all down, especially the battle lines coming up. Also today, 20 years and a world changed. Tomorrow, the world marks 20 years since the September 11th terror attacks in New York City. What happened inside the Canadian government that day, and what's the legacy today as the war in Afghanistan ends and more Canadians are being evacuated from Kabul? We'll sit down with John Manley, who was then Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister on that fateful day. This is Power Play. Let's get to the players.
Unlike Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole, who voted against making the ultra-rich pay their fair share, we believe that billionaires should pay their fair share.
I know you want to go harder and faster on vaccinations. I know you want to go harder and faster on climate change, and you get to choose exactly that in this election.
I'm not very much interested in leading Canada. However, I am very much interested in making sure that Quebec is entitled to its own vision for the future.
I have said before, and I'll say again tonight, that I do not believe that Mr. Trudeau is a real feminist.
Unlike Mr. Trudeau, I will care about monetary policy because we need to keep inflation low. There is a crisis hitting families, and Mr. Trudeau seems completely oblivious to that.
So this is the home stretch. Advance polls are open today, and the Go TV, Get Out the Vote teams everywhere are campaigning in full swing. The political arsenals, which means really millions of dollars, being spent right now on phone banks and ads on TV, radio, and all over social media. They're emptying out the arsenals. Nothing is being held back. Meanwhile, the entrails of the two main leaders' debates last night and the night before are being picked over for political omens. Who won? What changed in voters' mind? Did one moment stick out? Did one person stick out? Partisans disguised as prophets from every party are now auguring a victory for their personal choice as leader. But the truth is, it's up to you. It's up to voters, and no one really knows anything solid yet. Real changes in political momentum post-debate usually take about 48 hours to shake out. However, that won't stop us from at least trying to get a first sense of things. So let's look at the latest numbers from Nanos research. The Conservatives right now have a 33.3% support nationally, followed closely by the Liberals, 31.3%. The New Democrats followed to 19.2%. The Bloc up 6.6%. The People's Party 5%, and the Greens 3.8%. In the poll for preferred Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau comes out ahead of Mr. O'Toole by almost 3 percentage points. This poll, conducted by Nanos Research for CTV and the Globe and Mail, surveyed 1,200 people September 7th to 9th, and has a margin of error of minus 2.8 percentage points 19 times out of 20. So let's get started with a whip around on the campaigns from our reporters on the trail. Here's where the leaders are today, and battlegrounds tell you everything. Justin Trudeau is campaigning, no surprise, vote-rich Ontario. He and Liberal candidate Chrystia Freeland made a stop in Hamilton earlier today. And guess what? Aaron O'Toole mining those same voters. He started his day in Mississauga, Ontario, and he'll be in Whitby later tonight. That is called Battle GTA. Jagmeet Singh started his day off in Ottawa, taking advantage of the advance polls in Burnaby last night. in Burnaby. And tonight, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, back targeting, of course, Quebec ridings. And Green Party leader Annemie Paul kicked off her day in Ottawa before heading back to her riding in Toronto. And we'll tell you about what she said about that later in the program. So that's where the leaders are on the trail and in the polls. So let's check in now with our reporters who are following them more closely. CTV's Kevin Gallagher is on the road with the Liberals. Kevin, debates are turning points. Mr. Trudeau joined by Chrystia Freeland in Hamilton today. What were they feeling post-debate? What was their message?
Well, certainly today's message is all about healthcare and daycare, and there's a real push from Justin Trudeau to really try and differentiate the Liberals from the Conservatives on daycare especially. Even tonight, we're here in Toronto, Evan, and they're having a little rally at a restaurant in North York, and that's brought up again, that there's a concern if the Conservatives get in power, then all these daycare deals that the Liberals have signed will go by, and that daycare, federal daycare plan will get canceled once again. Of course, this is a real bone of contention for progressive parties like the NDP and the Greens, who also want this type of a program. But of course, the Liberals are saying, hey, vote for us or you won't get it. So that's a real part of the message today, post-debate.
Kev, in his post-debate scrum last night, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet took issue with the debate question over Quebec's Bill 21, the secularism law that bars public servants wearing religious garb. Something, for example, Jagmeet Singh has called discriminatory, and all the leaders have talked about, but they won't challenge. What did Mr. Trudeau, he's kind of brought that up himself today. What did he say, and what's behind that?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Evan, right? I mean, we heard this question asked about what he thought, about how it was asked, essentially. And so Justin Trudeau today said that he didn't like the way that question was asked. He was taken aback by the presumption carried within it, which is that because of Bill 21 and people that would support Bill 21 are therefore racist. And so he certainly called out the debate moderator, and at the same time taking this tact, as you pointed out, that the Liberal leader does not support Bill 21, this law in Quebec, of course, that bans the wearing of religious symbols for civil servants, but, wants essentially to not really weigh into whether the federal government will jump on a challenge. Of course, it is being challenged by civil society organizations within Quebec right now.
All right, Kevin Gallagher on the road with the Liberals, and I appreciate that, Kev. Thank you so much. Meantime, a Kitchener man, I should say, has been charged with 2 counts of uttering threats, charges stemming from a campaign stop last month in Cambridge, Ontario. Nothing has been proven in court, so that's just one of those elements on the campaign trail. Let's check in with the Conservative camp, and Aaron O'Toole made his way to Battleground GTA, as I've been saying. Does he have momentum behind him to take on the coveted 905? Let's find out. Joining me now is CTV's National News Ottawa Bureau Chief Joyce Napier. Joyce, already on the road with Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole. He is in Mississauga, Ontario. Welcome to Battleground GTA. Post-debate, though, a reaction in the Conservative camp and Aaron O'Toole.
Well, we asked him the question, how did he find the way that the debate was organized and the questions? Some of them, he said, were pretty loaded. I asked him if he thought that prevented him from, his face-to-face with Justin Trudeau, because that's what most people wanted to see. These are the 2 front runners. How are they going to go at each other? Will they be able to go at each other? So this is an interesting debate. Evan, you and I, we've covered a lot of them, where the debate becomes the news more so than what was said during the debate. The format, the fact that the leaders were interrupted quite often. There was a lot of discipline, but a lot of interruptions. So it was certainly more aggressive than the 2 French debates combined, which I listened to quite attentively. So I thought that was interesting. I wondered if it was a cultural thing or if it was a language thing or just the format that allowed for more punches in the face, because there were quite a few of them.
Okay, but there was no knockout punch in the face. Aaron O'Toole, one thing he didn't take a lot of attacks. There wasn't as many as some thought, given the fact that polls have shown that he's ahead. What does he do now? This is the final week, so they're through the debates. Okay, now I guess it's Go TV, get out the vote. Voting starts today, advanced polling, right, Joyce? So what are they doing on the Conservative campaign?
Well, what they did is we left this morning early, and guess what? We went to the GTA. So depending who you talk to, there are 50, 60 seats here. About 10 of them are too close to call. So expect Mr. O'Toole to be here. Expect Justin Trudeau to be here quite a bit. There will be tight races. This afternoon, we go to Whitby. Now, the interesting thing about Whitby, it was former Finance Minister Jim Flaherty's riding. The Conservatives lost it in 2015. They could not win it back in 2019. So Mr. O'Toole is going back there hoping to win it back. So expect those kind of whistle stops for the Conservative leader going into those ridings that were lost in 2015, lost in 2019, but because sort of the wind seems to be changing for him and in his favor, these are the kind of ridings he's going to go to.
Joyce, I got to commend you just on your focus, to be candid. I mean, you and I sitting here talking while Felix Auger-Aliassime's playing in the semifinals of the U.S. Open and Leylah Fernandez making the finals last night during the debate. I'm telling you, these two great Canadians, it means we must love our politics if we're skipping that. CTV.
Absolutely. It's a different kind of excitement.
It's too close to call. That's CTV's National News Bureau Chief here in Ottawa, Joyce Napier. Thanks, Joyce. Okay, finally, let's go to the NDP campaign where leader Jagmeet Singh broke away from the pack to head out west. Let's check in with CTV's Annie Bergeron-Oliver. Annie, Mr. Singh returned to BC to vote in the advanced polls in Burnaby. And look at you, literally on the move. What post-debate reaction there? What was going on for Mr. Singh?
Well, the NDP thinks that Mr. Singh won the debate yesterday. They believe that he did exactly what he needed to do and presented a clear option. And he reiterated that this morning in a press conference in Ottawa, saying that this election, people have a choice, and it is not necessarily just the Conservatives and the Liberal Party that choice is between. I asked about the strategy, and he said he's going to try to convince Canadians that he is a real potential to form government, and that he says he's the only party that is going to very clearly pay for their promises by the wealthiest. Now, as you mentioned, he is going to be in Burnaby South today. He was there previously, but today is the first day of advance voting. So he's going to be joining some first-time voters, and he's going to go in and do his voting. And this is a riding the NDP is confident they're going to win. He won last time by more than 4,000 votes, about 37%. The riding's been NDP since it was created back in 2015. And I think, this was a very conscious choice, Evan. They believe that they are going to do very strong performance here. 11 seats for the NDP right now. They hope that they can, 5, 6, 7, perhaps even more seats.
Before heading to BC, though, he was at the Jack Layton building in Ottawa, and he finally announced that the platform costing for the NDP will come out tomorrow, on Saturday. The advanced voting starts today. Are they literally trying to not make that a thing by basically last-minute costing revelation here?
Well, you heard that criticism in the debate last night, and reporters were asking the same thing. He was the first party to come out with a platform, and it was released a week before the election happened. So a lot of people are saying, advanced polls are here. How can you be waiting so long to release your costed platform? I asked what the delay was about and whether it had anything to do with the parliamentary budget officer. Mr. Singh said that takes time, and they're looking forward to it. And he says Canadians know that they're going to pay for their promises by taxing the wealthiest.
Okay, Annie Bergeron-Oliver, on the move, literally on the campaign trail. That's a good sense of what people are going through. Very glamorous, by the way, Annie. Thank you so much. So that was a check-in where the leaders are. Let's check in where the leaders are in the polls. Nick Nanos, our pollster, joins us with the latest numbers. Nick, obviously everyone's trying to figure out who won the debate last night and did it shake it up. We saw your numbers earlier. It's a tight race. Just make sure people appreciate these numbers done before last night's debate. What can we expect post-debate?
Well, what we're going to know in the next couple of days as to whether anyone had the upper hand or manages to get any momentum coming out of this debate. And if you remember, Evan, after the TVA debate, it was unsure what had happened. And then a couple of days later, Justin Trudeau's numbers started to move while the Bloc and also the Conservative numbers started to drop in the province of Quebec. It'll be interesting to see whether there's any trend. It's too early to tell right now.
it's such a tight race that you're now calling it Justin O'Toole, right? It's like Brangelina. They've been basically tied together at the hip in the polls. But the truth is there wasn't a, quote, knockout punch. I know those cliches. But when people say, and I've been, like you, it does take about 48 hours to decide, what are you looking for that could decide, campaign momentum? Because we're in the home stretch here.
Well, absolutely. What we're looking for basically are mistakes. If any of the federal party leaders or their campaigns make a mistake right now, it could be politically lethal for them in terms of the outcome of the election. But Evan, where we are is a weakened minority government. It could be a weakened liberal minority government. It could be a weak conservative minority government. But what people have to realize is that usually in minority governments, it's a government plus one party. We may be in a situation where with a weak minority government, it'll be a minority government plus two, that the Liberals and the New Democrats, for example, will not have enough seats to pass legislation without another party. And the Conservatives and the Bloc won't have enough seats to pass legislation without another party. That's a big game changer in terms of Parliament.
Yeah. Now, that's great, Nick. Then we can do this all over again. Just before we go, I want to do spoiler factor. Mr. Blanchet from the Bloc Québécois was open last night when he said, I'm not running to be prime minister. People are like, wait a second. Of course you're not. So, but spoiler, could the Bloc play spoiler to either conservative or liberal fortunes in Quebec? Outside the debate, as I was walking in, the People's Party, who you've got polling at 5%, had a big rally. Could they play spoiler to the Conservatives? Annamie Paul, Green Party leader, made a strong impression last night. Her first debate, first time she's been out of her riding on the campaign trail, strong impression last night. Could she be spoiler to the NDP or the Liberal vote? What's your view on the spoiler factor?
I think the two most likely spoilers in this election will be the New Democrats and also the People's Party of Canada. The strong showing or a consistent showing by Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats will basically deny the Liberals a chance to win a majority government or even a strong minority government. And for Aaron O'Toole, if he was playing fantasy politics, if the People's Party didn't exist, think of it this way, Evan. The Conservatives, instead of being at 33, they'd be at 38, and the Liberals would be at 31, and we'd be talking about the Conservatives getting ready to form a government. So both of those parties, the New Democrats and the People's Party, could be spoilers for each of the frontrunners.
All right. That, of course, gets us to strategic voting, and the last days of a campaign are always, in some ways, the most interesting. Nick Nanos, it's great, and probably like me, Nick's on coffee, no sleep, and a whole lot of adrenaline, so more polling to come. Thanks, Nick. Meantime, the leaders have put aside their differences and recorded a unified message calling on Canadians to get vaccinated against COVID-19.
We're all in this together.
We've come so far in the fight against COVID.
That was probably the only moment where they sang from the same song sheet. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh sent a letter to all party leaders urging them to send a message to eligible Canadians who haven't yet got their shots to do it as quickly as possible. Mr. Singh's request came after new federal modeling showed Canada could see more than 15,000 new cases a day by the beginning of October if the rate of transmission remains as it is. And the National Advisory Committee on Immunization is recommending a third dose of the COVID-19 vaccine for immunocompromised people, but they're not calling this a booster shot. Instead, NACI says immunocompromised people should receive a primary series of 3 doses, and those already fully vaccinated should be offered an additional shot. Studies show those with compromised immune systems have an increased response after a third dose of an mRNA vaccine, while people in the general pop see that response after just 2. A booster, however, is used when protection of primary series wanes over time. Remember, the WHO has said to a lot of developed countries, please do not go ahead and urge third doses for the general population before the rest of the world gets at least 1 or 2. Coming up, the final debate is over. Our Friday panel of strategists will debrief the winners, the losers, who hit, who missed. We break it all down on Power Play. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, last night, rising Canadian tennis sensation Leylah Fernandez won her U.S. Open match to make it to the finals after just turning 19. Toronto Blue Jays finished a 4-game sweep over the New York Yankees. But there was another high-stakes Canadian face-off last night. Leaders went head-to-head in the sole Canadian English language debate of the election. Who came out on top? What will change? What performance stood out? Let's break it all down and what happens now in the election endgame. Our panel of strategists are here. Joining us are Greg McEachern from Proof Strategies, who leans Liberal, Adrian Batcher, the Toronto Sun's editor-in-chief. They have a conservative perspective, and Carl Belanger from Traction Strategies, who was the interim national director of the NDP. And Greg Weston from Earnscliffe Strategy Group is our neutral voice. Welcome, everybody. My goodness. Okay, let's start with the neutral voice. Greg, what stood out last night, sort of hits and misses for you?
Two Gregs. You got two Gregs.
Greg Weston. I got my compass is spinning. Weston.
Yeah. It was one of those things that was almost unwatchable. I think everybody has said that. So what does that mean? It means that most people are not going to come away thinking, okay, now I understand what the Conservative policy on this is or the NDP position is on this. So it becomes a little bit of how do I feel about them? And in this tight a race, that matters so much. Aaron O'Toole, he didn't have to win the night. He just had to come across really a first introduction to a lot of voters as someone who is a reasonable alternative if you don't like Justin Trudeau. Low expectations, he probably exceeded them. So I think each one of them did what they came to do. The one who really needed to hit it out of the park was Justin Trudeau. And you heard Nick Nanos, as always, will need to wait 2 or 3 days after this to see how voters respond.
Okay, let's go to Greg, the other Greg. Speaking of Trudeau, how did he do? What did he need to do, Greg McEachern?
Oh, I'm other Greg. I've been, relegated. I think I'm going to take a look at all three debates. And to Nick's point, we don't know what traction is going to happen. But that first debate, it was the Prime Minister who kind of heard what Aaron O'Toole was saying about assault weapons. And for 5 days after, that kind of changed the tone of the campaign where the Conservative leader had an answer to that. I think on the second debate, the Prime Minister did really well, but it was after the debate. It was during the scrum and that bit with Rebel Media, and I think the NDP leader did well on that as well. So we'll have to see where we're going to go out of the debate. But for the next week, I'd expect you see a lot of contrast. Starting with, for one, you're going to see Justin Trudeau up and at him every day. You're not going to see him perhaps in a hotel every day like his Conservative counterpart. You're going to hear about things like abortion, healthcare, childcare. You're probably going to hear people like me talk about someone who doesn't have kids but works in business and can tell you that one of the big impediments to get your best people back into the workplace, and realistically, we're talking about women. It impacts women way more than it does their male partners. Is the lack of childcare, and there's a very big distinction between the Liberals and the Conservatives on that, and I expect we'll hear a lot about that in the coming days.
All right, let's go to Adrian, or as I now have to call her, Greg, since everybody on this panel is called Greg, apparently.
Please don't. Please don't call me Greg.
Well, what did you make of Mr. O'Toole's performance, and what stood out for you?
My mother wouldn't like that very much. Well,
Adrian, what
the big
stood out
standout for me
for Mr.
was
O'Toole?
Annemie Paul. I mean, in spite of her party being so... Oh, so Mr. O'Toole was able to hold his own. Certainly, Justin Trudeau, you've got 4 people hammering away at you. 3 of those 4 people actually want his job. So, it's a difficult situation to be in. But Trudeau didn't handle it well. He was very flustered. He was angry. Whereas Aaron O'Toole came across thoughtful. He pushed forward on his messaging. He attempted to, in spite of the format, put forward some thoughtful policy discussions. But I was just saying, Annemie Paul was the standout for me out of all of them.
But we know she's certainly not going to be the next prime minister. So based on what I just heard from Greg McEachran, it's ostensibly what the Conservatives are expecting, Evan, in the next week and a half. The Liberals are going to go low. They're going to go negative. They're going to go, throw all the things that they usually do at Conservatives. And the Conservative campaign is certainly ready for that.
Okay, Jagmeet Singh, Greg Belanger. Just kidding, Carl. What did you make of Jagmeet Singh's performance? And he's got to not only make the case, but he's got to hold on to votes that the Liberals will want in the classic strategic voting pincer move. Did he do enough to do that?
Well, he certainly came across well yesterday. He had a couple of good lines. He has this habit of trying to switch topics here and there. I mean, we're talking about China, and he moves on to long-term care facilities. I don't think that works for him. But when he sticks to the message and when he goes after the prime minister and ignores the other, that's when he's at his best. And we saw that yesterday. I think that's probably enough to solidify some of the vote, but there's 10 days left, and who knows what's going to happen. I mean, you heard Justin Trudeau talking today about a vote for the NDPs, a vote for the Conservatives. We've heard that before. Sometime it worked, sometime it didn't. We'll see if it works this time. I agree with Adrian that Annemie Paul had a good night. Probably her last hurrah, but for those who did not know her, she came across fairly well. But the key moment of this debate, I think, was if François Blanchet and the whole issue of racism in Quebec and discriminatory laws. That issue is blowing up, and I'm not sure who's that going to benefit, but it's certainly going to hurt probably Justin Trudeau and maybe even Erin O'Toole.
Okay, speaking of that, and Greg Weston, here it was interesting that today Mr. Trudeau picked up that question to Mr. Blanchet about the secularization law. He wasn't really asked about it. Let me play the clip, and I want to try to understand the strategy behind this. Here's the clip.
It is wrong to suggest that Quebecers are racist. As a Quebecer, I found that question really offensive. I think, yes, there's lots of work to do to continue to fight systemic racism across this country, in every part of this country. But I don't think that question was acceptable or appropriate.
Greg, why did he decide to get in on that exchange, and what's the politics there?
Well, I think he had to know, especially being a Quebecer, that issue, as Carl said, completely blew up in certainly in the Quebec media, and for anybody watching that from Quebec would have picked up on that. So, what's he doing? He's trying to play that very careful game of putting votes in Quebec without alienating anybody in the rest of the country. So you heard him say, "Yes, we have lots of things to do," but a very strong statement, and it wasn't aimed at any one of the other candidates. It was actually aimed at the person who asked the question. So it's kind of amorphous for voters. Is not taking down one of the other candidates. That was a direct appeal to Quebecers that he's on their side.
Yeah, and he wants those votes. Okay, I got about a minute and a half, so I'm going to go, Mr. McEachran. We'll start with you, just real quick. What are you expecting in the week ahead? Like, what is the key factor in the week ahead? And we'll go around from Adrian to Carl. Greg.
Key factor is to keep for the Liberals is to keep Justin Trudeau with that better pace that he's been showing at different times, where he seems calm, cool, and collected. The momentum factor seems to have stopped on all sides. So it's now what you can eke out. What this campaign has been good at in the past is riding by riding, getting those seats back. I think that's what you're going to see.
Well, you got a football behind you. Could be 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Adrian.
Canadians seem to like what they're seeing of Erin O'Toole. He needs to continue to show that positive moving forward. They've got a good message with their recovery plan and what they want to do to move Canada out of the pandemic, get people back to work, bring back our economy, and unify this country. Stick to that messaging and don't get folded into the pitfalls the Liberals will try to drag them into.
Carl, last thing.
Well, I think you'll hear Liberals call for strategic voting. I think you'll hear Conservatives try to downplay the Liberals' attack on abortion, guns, and other issues. And the NDP will have to solidify their vote. The key thing to me, though, is how will the Bloc Québécois benefit from what's happening? Certainly, Premier Legault added oil to the fire today. All political leaders in Quebec did. Can't wait to see the coverage this weekend and all the editorials. It'll be something to see.
All right, Carl, Adrian, and the equally beloved Gregs. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. I know no one's sleeping there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
See, everything's political now. Coming up, it's been 20 years since September 11th, a day that shook the world indelibly and united a country that's commonly split down the middle. But what was it like for Canadians who rallied in response to America's time of need? We'll look back 20 years ago, 9/11, with a very special guest next. Stay with us.
It's the day after. I think that the tragedy is enormous for the Americans, for the Canadians, and for everybody in the world. It's a big attack against democracy, and we have to keep fighting terrorism around the world.
20 years tomorrow since the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York that left the United States and the world changed forever. Nearly 3,000 people, including at least 24, many Canadians, lost their lives. And although the feeling of the shock and the despair of what was witnessed is still present for many people, what have we learned from those past 2 decades? Let's find out. Joining me now is the Honourable John Manley, former Deputy Prime Minister, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was that on September 11, 2001, following the attacks. He became the chair of the Cabinet Committee on Public Security and Anti-Terrorism, so he knows this file well. Mr. Manley, it was a pleasure to have you on the program. Boy, is it hard to believe it's been 20 years, and I remember that day, and I know you do very well. Can you walk us through from the position you were in, how you found out about the events of that day, and what happens when you hear about a terror attack like that?
Well, first of all, I had a kind of unusual day because I got up that morning, September 11th, in Berlin, and flew from Berlin through Frankfurt, got in Air Canada Frankfurt to Toronto flight, and we were over the Atlantic Ocean when the flight attendants came to me, asked me to go to the galley at the back of that flight deck and told me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. A few minutes later, the pilots asked me to go to the flight deck where I was able to listen to the reporting coming from BBC News over the radio waves and find out what had happened. And everything that ensued seemed more surprising than the last. You'll remember, Evan, the early reporting was all over the map. And even at an official level, we just didn't know whether there were other flights. The 2 planes hit the World Trade Center. That's when we knew that it was an attack, and that's when President Bush was informed. And then a plane hit the Pentagon in Washington, and then a plane crashed in Pennsylvania. Who knew how many other planes were part of this overall conspiracy? So it was a day of anxiety, of chaos, of worry, both at an official level and also at a personal level. I mean, my family knew I was in the air, and that caused them some moments of worry.
As the chair then of the Cabinet Committee on Public Security and Anti-Terrorism, you had to make some quick choices, not only on that day 20 years ago, but changes that basically have transformed public security since. What was the first kind of response, and in your view, what has been the lasting legacy from a security point of view in Canada?
Well, there were a few things that had to be done right away, and ironically, the simplest is the one that's probably been the one that's ensured that none of these things happened again, and that was to make sure that the pilots could lock the door into the cabin. so that, exactly what happened on 9/11 couldn't happen again. And then we added, of course, significant airport security. But my concern and my preoccupation was that Canada could not be seen to be a point of vulnerability to the United States.
Yeah, the border. Talk about that. Isn't it ironic 20 years later, we're talking about a border that's barely open. And when 20 years ago, the idea that any closure to the border was an existential threat to Canadians' economic existence, and you had to deal with that.
Well, we did. And in fact, it was never officially closed, but for all practical purposes, it did close. And the trucks were lined up and the just-in-time inventory systems went out the window, and nobody really knew who was in charge on the U.S. side of the border. We ended up having to loan customs and agents to the Americans to help them inspect the trucks that needed to get into the United States in those days following 9/11. So that became a very high priority for me. And one of the things that we had to take on board as Canadians out of that was that as far as the United States was concerned, post 9/11, security trumped trade.
Yeah.
And I heard that from Democrats and Republicans alike. And we just had to address their concerns about security if we wanted to continue to prosper from the trade relationship that we had built over the years.
Just two last things. Let me pick up on that, because that's both understandable, but of course 20 years later that sounds a lot like a justification for a kind of isolationism in the name of a very broad definition of security, as you know. But here we are 20 years later, and the war in Afghanistan is finally over. So there's an arc to this moment, as you know better than anybody. Talk about that if you could. 20 years later, the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, Canada trying desperately to get interpreters out and not succeeding, frankly, in many cases. How do you kind of mark this time, this 22-decade-long arc?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of views, of course, about the Afghanistan situation. And it's important for Canadians to remember that right off the top, the effort in Afghanistan was not about creating some kind of Afghan democracy. It was about disabling al-Qaeda and its ability to wreak havoc. And we took that on. But it wasn't just the U.S. and a few allies. It was the United Nations. And then it was NATO. NATO declared Article 5, which is the mutual defense provision of the NATO treaty, for the one time in its history after 9/11, committing all of us to the defense of the United States. So that if you were to say, Evan, that multilateralism is the cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy, the engagement in Afghanistan was a multilateral effort led in the first case by the United Nations. Did it succeed? You know, I think there was some overreach. I think that we could have done very well with more limited expectations of Afghanistan. The way I put it is that it took we in the West 700 years from the Magna Carta till we gave women the right to vote. And we were trying to transform almost a medieval society into a Western democracy in a few short years, and it fell flat. The insurgency was fueled from Pakistan. We were never able to really shut that down. And the distraction of the U.S. by their invasion of Iraq, I think, was the final straw in trying to hold the Afghan mission together. And I think it was on a pretty straight decline after that, despite a lot of treasure and a lot of lives and a lot of blood that was lost.
20 years, Mr. Manley. We remember the events as history. We live with the consequences as our future. John Manley was a key part of that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure, Evan. Thank you.
Coming up, the fallout of the big debates. What happens now? What should you expect? The press gallery is next. Stay right here with Power Play. Well, we got the English language debate showdown last night. Now we're into the final push of the campaign. What happens now? Did anything change? Let's break down the debate with our press gallery, Susan Delacourt, national columnist with the Toronto Star, Rachel Aiello, the online producer for CTV's Parliamentary Bureau, Bob Fife, the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief. Okay, Susan, let's start with you. Breakout moment last night. What did you think?
You know, Evan, you were there and know this as well as anybody. It was very hard for anybody to have a breakout moment last night. I would give Annemie Paul credit for having one. Francois Blanchette had a breakout moment or breakdown moment, you might say. I thought all the anger was going to be outside with Maxime Bernier and his forces out there. It turns out that it was in the room as well. I think neither Justin Trudeau nor Erin O'Toole got the breakout moment they needed. That may help Erin O'Toole a little bit more because he's running a front runners campaign. Justin Trudeau, I think, is frustrated that he didn't get a chance to go after him. But I think the breakout moment in all, I think everybody, or at least in my neck of the woods, went away from that debate saying, we still need to know more.
Yeah. Bob Fife, what stood out to you?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister was put on the defensive throughout the whole evening. He had a few moments when he was trying to deliver a knockout punch to Erin O'Toole, and he was stopped by the moderator, and I think that was at a disadvantage to Mr. Trudeau. A lot of angry Liberals over that. I think that Mr. O'Toole did very well last night. He got his message out. He came across as prime ministerial. Also, I thought that the NDP leader did very well as well. He had a few moments where he's a bit off script, but on the whole, he came back, and I think he did. I think he did a solid performance. And I agree with Susan that I thought Annemie Paul had an outstanding display last night. Unfortunately, her party has already, throwing her over the cliff, so it's not probably going to benefit the Green Party at all. So I think as we head into the final week of the campaign, Evan, the wind is in the sails of Mr. O'Toole, and Mr. Trudeau has really got to come back.
Okay, Rach, can I just pick up on what both Susan and Bob talked about Annemie Paul? Most Canadians hadn't seen her before. She has this breakout moment. I think maybe you three know more than me on this, but the weirdest political admission I've ever heard on the campaign confession. Annemie Paul, who has a breakout moment, then people are asking her, why don't you go out and campaign with people? Listen to what she said today in this campaign confession. Check this out.
I wanted to make sure, and I still want to make sure, that if I travel somewhere, first, that I'm wanted, and that's not a given. And then secondly, that it's going to help our local candidates, and that's also, unfortunately, not a given. And that's something that I have to recognize, and it's incredibly difficult to acknowledge that, but those are the facts, that it might not always be the best thing for me to be in a riding, and I certainly never want to be a distraction to any of our candidates.
Rach, have you ever heard a leader say, I can't travel because I don't know if I'm wanted and I don't know if I'm actually going to help? And she's not gone to a single other riding outside of Ottawa for the debates. Rachel.
Well, Evan, I guess there's always room for firsts in politics. I mean, give her credit for being transparent and truthful with Canadians on that. I'm not sure, with all eyes on her after the successful performance she had last night, this would have been the message that other campaigns would have thought to be the one that you were going to say the day after a good debate. But it's a blessing and a curse, I think, these debates, in the sense of you have the opportunity to define yourself on a national stage. And I think what we saw last night is none of the leaders really stuck that. So it's going to be up to all of them, Annemie Paul included now, with a bit more attention on her, to make the case to undecided voters who were listening in last night, hoping for answers and likely didn't get them.
Okay, Susan, back to you. You've done a lot of campaigns. I've never heard a leader say that ever, but you can comment on that. But sort of on the bigger picture as we get to the home stretch, what are you looking for party leaders to do? Susan.
I agree. I have never heard it's a little bit like the movie Bulworth, if anybody's seen it, where the candidate goes out and decides to tell the truth all over the place, and maybe it could be wildly successful. I am waiting for somebody to define the ballot question in this election. And I don't think I have it yet. And I am watching the tension between change and stability at the moment. I'm intrigued by the way in which the non-incumbent, Aaron O'Toole, is championing himself as the stable one, and that Justin Trudeau, because of all the turmoil during his time in office, is seen as change. He was seen as a different kind of change in 2015. But those forces and what Canadians want because of the pandemic and how they identify change and stability and hope and all of those things that we understand elections are fed by, I think they've been overturned by the pandemic, and we still don't know how they're going to settle.
Well, that's interesting. Bob?
Look, I think it's obvious now that Justin Trudeau and the Liberal team made a very big miscalculation in thinking that they were going to walk easily to a majority government by calling an election in the summer months, and it has backfired on them. Mr. Trudeau is now fighting for his political life. He has not been able to articulate a reason why we should be supporting him as Canadians, and he's used all kinds of wedge issues against the Conservatives, and most of them have not worked. Any damage to the Conservatives have been done by the Conservatives themselves. I don't think that Mr. O'Toole has been particularly effective, other than the fact that he's moved the party to the centre-right, and it's given people an opportunity to think, if I don't like Trudeau, maybe I can trust this guy. So, look, I think we're still going to end up, at the end of the day, with a minority Liberal government. It's possible, if people are lying to the pollsters, that we'll get a minority Conservatives. But the final week of this campaign is going to be very exciting, Evan, and we'll see how things end up.
I feel like the debate format last night. Rach, I literally have 10 seconds, and that says it all about everything we're talking about. So the karma train, go ahead.
The only other factor I would have people keep in mind here, Evan, is advanced polls, pandemic voting, and turnout. That's the other question we're waiting to see here in terms of how that will shape the future of our democracy.
She nailed it. All right, Bob, Rachel, and Susan have got to leave it there. That's all the time we've got. Thanks for watching Power Play. We will be back on Monday. Take care, hug your loved ones, and I'll see you then.